Shortly after the launch of the airstrikes, the United States President made NATO's intentions plain.
Our mission is clear: to demonstrate the seriousness of NATO's purpose so that the Serbian leaders understand the imperative of reversing course, to deter an even bloodier offensive against innocent civilians in Kosovo, and if necessary, to seriously damage the Serbian military's capacity to harm the people of Kosovo.
But is this the right military strategy? Bob Marshall Andrews for the prosecution. Your next witness, please.
Yes. I call Flight Lieutenant John Nichol.
Flight Lieutenant John Nichol was an RAF navigator shot down and held prisoner of war during the Gulf War. He has also operated in the no-fly zone over Bosnia.
John Nichol, with the exception of Sir Michael Rose, who will be called in due course, you are the only serviceman who has seen active service who will be called in the course of this trial. I want to ask you about the tactics and strategy that NATO has adopted.
On day one of this campaign, we were told that the mission aims were to curb the Serbian military's capability and to prevent a humanitarian disaster. Day 60 is here, and we've got 1 million refugees on our hands and perhaps 200,000 men missing, many of them killed. They're the stark facts. They're the reality of the situation. NATO has failed in its campaign, not because it doesn't have the military capability, but because the political leadership hasn't allowed it to operate in the way that it should have.
What do you say to the decision to wage war by bombing from 15,000 feet, bombing Serbia and Kosovo, whilst providing no protection whatsoever for the Albanians within Kosovo from the Serbs whose own country was being bombed?
To believe that bombing can achieve our aim was crass ineptitude. No cruise missile, no laser-guided bomb can stop a truckload of Serbian special police intent on murder, rape and destruction. There is one thing, and one thing alone, that can do that, and that is putting our men on the ground with rifles and telling them to stop.
Should this have been done at the beginning?
This should have been done in June last year, where our government gave Mr. Milosevic his first of 6 final warnings.
And what was the sense of President Clinton saying at the beginning of this conflict that a land war could be ruled out? Was that wise?
This was irresponsible in the extreme. To send a message on day one of the campaign that you will not use troops in offensive capability sends a message to your enemy that you are not fully prepared to go ahead with the action.
Bob Marshall Andrews, thank you
very much.
Michael Ignatieff for the defence of NATO. Please cross-examine.
Lieutenant Nichol, I'm a little confused here. I can't figure out which side you're on here. You seem to be saying not that NATO is guilty for what it's done, it's guilty for not doing enough.
I'm saying that at the start of this campaign, Ben Bradshaw's government said that we were going to prevent a humanitarian disaster. NATO has expended billions of pounds worth of weapons. Not one murder has been prevented, not one rape has been prevented, and NATO is guilty of that.
But let's be clear, do you think, let's just be clear, do you think that NATO should have intervened militarily to stop ethnic cleansing in Kosovo, yes or no?
If we truly believe in stopping the problem, then yes, quite obviously, if we truly believe in it.
Now, but you're a military man, and military men don't like having political controls put on war, but you'd accept this as a 19-nation alliance. It's under the democratic control of citizens. You don't seriously want to take all the political and democratic controls off the exercise of warfare, do you?
I don't want to take any political controls off anybody. What I want is, if we truly believe in stopping murder and rape, in stopping it. We're discussing a rather pointless game here. The fact is that we haven't prevented the murders and we haven't prevented the rapes. And it's because the military hasn't been allowed to do that. And that is the charge.
But that side is saying, let's not use any military means.
No, it isn't. That's completely untrue. That side is saying that NATO has failed in its aims, and it quite obviously has failed in its aims. We have 1 million refugees on our hands, and we have tens of thousands of people dead.
How can we say we failed in the aims when we're in day 60 of a campaign whose end state we can't yet predict?
Quite obviously, because the aim, as we heard the President and the Prime Minister saying in the VT there, that the aim was to prevent a humanitarian disaster. We have a humanitarian disaster. What are we going to do now?
John Nichol, thank you very much. Ben Bradshaw for the defence. Your next witness, please.
I call Sir Michael Alexander.
Sir Michael Alexander was at the Foreign Office for 30 years, including 6 as the UK's permanent ambassador to NATO.
Sir Michael, why do you believe that the NATO action was the right thing to do?
NATO had no choice last March. After 8 years of unsuccessful and ultimately futile negotiation and repeated massacres, the room for compromise had run out. Had our governments backed away in March, a cancer of self-disgust would have eaten away at the heart of NATO. Respect for human rights in Europe would have been seen to be a fiction. The Kosovo itself would have continued to bleed, and the Balkans would have continued to putrefy.
How do you address John Nichol's criticisms of the way the action has advanced?
NATO does not operate on a basis of military logic. NATO is a coalition of 19 democracies, as you've all heard. It operates by consensus. Unity is an overriding priority. As a result, the voices of the most hesitant governments always carry particular weight. NATO's military structure is cautious, it's accountable, and it's very transparent. The initial reluctance of electorates in March to support a ground war meant that we had no option but to start with an air war. The further assumption was that support for a ground war would grow. That has happened, and where we now are is that NATO is about to authorize the assembly of a force of 50,000 men.
Finally, and very briefly, how successful do you think the action has been?
The air war initially should have been conducted more vigorously, but in fact it's been astonishingly successful. 10,000 pieces of ordnance have been dropped, less than 30 have gone astray, a third of 1%. 20,000 missions have been flown and not a single pilot has been lost. By July, we may well be able, because Serb resistance is crumbling, by July we may well be able to go into Kosovo on the ground without risking excessive losses.
Thank you very much indeed, Ben Bradshaw. Please stay with us, Sir Michael. Bob Marshall-Andrews for the prosecution.
Yes. Sir Michael, may I remind you immediately, and through you remind Michael Ignatieff, that the charge here is that NATO is charged with blundering, ill-prepared into Kosovo crisis without a viable strategy to achieve its aims, and thereby worsening a humanitarian disaster. Now, looking at that as being the basis of this indictment, do you agree with me that to conduct a war by bombing from 15,000 feet has this net effect that it transfers risk from combatants, of which there have been no casualties, to civilians on the ground?
There have been casualties on the ground. It may be that had pilots flown lower, those casualties would have been less. But let's make no mistake, wars mean the spilling of innocent blood, wars mean the pollution of the environment, wars mean the destruction of property. It's Milosevic. It is Milosevic who brought this war.
Yes. And therefore they should be as short as possible, is that right?
They should indeed be as short as possible, but your side needs to make up their mind whether they want more war or no war.
Let me put this to you.
We've had completely contradictory interventions from your people.
Let me put this to you. If you were going to go to war, as Flight Lieutenant Nichol has said, the alternative to going to war is to go to war as hard as you can. Is that right?
You go to war with the support of your electorates.
Yes.
You can go no harder than your electorates will support.
And
the electorates would not have supported an all-out ground war to start with, however logical militarily that might have been.
You say it was logical?
Militarily logical? Of course it was logical.
Yes. Well, in that case... Yes. Now, may I just ask you this, while we're on the subject of accidental death, are you in favour of the deliberate bombing on the 24th of April of the Serb television station in which people were deliberately and knowingly killed?
I'm certainly, when dealing with a fascist regime of the kind that we have in Belgrade, I'm in favour of destroying their ability to mislead their own people.
Sir Michael, thank you very much indeed. Sir Michael, thank you very much indeed. Bob Marshall-Andrews, thank you. Thank you, sir. Now, prosecution, your first piece of video evidence, please.
I call as our next piece of evidence a piece of video that might demonstrate a slight misunderstanding on the part of two very important people prosecuting this campaign as to what it is they're supposed to be doing.
I don't see this as a long-term operation. I think that this is something that the deter and damage is something that is achievable within a relatively short period of time.
We need to find a way to reconcile the conditions of a coalition war with the principle of military operations such as surprise and the use of overwhelming force. We did not apply either in Operation Allied Force, and this costs time, effort, and potentially additional casualties, and the net result being that the campaign is undoubtedly prolonged.
Michael Ignatieff, it does suggest a bit of confusion at the top of this Allied effort.
I think we have to face the simple fact that we live in liberal democracies, in which if you're going to take the ultimate risk of waging war, you have to consult with your public, you have to carry them along. General Naumann is saying he is a military leader who has to answer to 19 governments. He has to keep them on side, he has to win their consent. You can't have it both ways. If you want ruthlessness and violence, American-led terror, that's one thing. If you actually want a democracy to wage war, it wages war with a careful calibration of moral risk. And that is what's been done in this case.
Michael Ignatieff, thank you. After the break, did the NATO bombings play a part in the escalating refugee crisis? The statistics are horrific. More than 1.5 million people have fled their homes in Kosovo, some to the safety of camps across the borders. Others hide in the mountains, whilst unknown thousands have died or been killed on the roadside. Could the disaster have been foreseen? And how well has NATO dealt with the humanitarian crisis? Defence, your first witness.
I call Jürgen Grünet.
Jürgen Grünet was part of the UN monitoring team based in Kosovo before they pulled out in March of this year.
Jürgen, you and I were both in Kosovo at about the same time. You were trying to monitor a ceasefire between the two sides. Let's establish one key fact here. Milosevic's military campaign had already displaced substantial numbers of Kosovo civilians before the current NATO campaign.
Several 100,000 people, yes. I do have a small correction, though. It was not a UN mission, an OSCE mission. That was...
Being the security organization
right.
for
yes.
Europe. Right.
Yeah.
And you were charged to try and monitor ceasefire violations on both sides, but it is also the fact that the vast preponderance of those violations were on the Serb side.
We certainly saw violations of the ceasefire from both sides. Provocations on the part of the KLA and huge operations on the part of the Serb police and army. What can be said in general is that the Serb reactions to KLA provocations were very often far out of proportion to the original provocation.
Okay. Mr. Grünet, is there any way that NATO could have foreseen, you were on the ground, whether they could have foreseen the full scale of Milosevic's deportations?
I don't know what NATO could, but we certainly could not in the mission on the ground in Kosovo. None of us had any imagination to foresee, you know, that this would mean a return to Europe of the first half of the 1940s.
Now, you withdrew shortly before the bombing. Would it be fair to say that the Serbs had withdrawn all cooperation and effectively drove you out?
At the point when we were ordered out by the chairmanship of the OSCE, there was no ceasefire to verify anymore, and our job really had become impossible.
Finally, you were unarmed. You had nothing, as far as I remember, except a Swiss Army knife when I talked to you.
That's right.
Do you now believe that if international forces have to go in the future, they will have to be armed?
I see no other way.
And why is that?
Well, the situation on the ground now is of a character that you know, to go in there in safety, certainly arms would be necessary.
But that's Milosevic's primary objection to this NATO deal. to have NATO troops. And you're saying that, in fact, armed NATO forces will be absolutely necessary for any kind of peace.
I see no other way.
Thank you, Michael. Germaine Greer for the prosecution, your cross-examination.
Yes, when you were observing in Kosovo, what was your impression as to who was committing the atrocities against the Kosovo Albanians? Was it just the Serbian army? Was it Serbian army irregulars? Or was it also ordinary people, neighbors and such, who were attacking their Albanian neighbors?
Mostly the Serb police.
The Serb police?
Yes.
Are you aware that the situation has now changed to some extent and people are reporting that they have been attacked by their neighbors?
I've heard that. We were not on the ground since
But this would imply, would it not, that there has been a tremendous increase of intolerance towards Albanians on the part of their Serbian neighbors?
That's very difficult for me to judge, being outside of Kosovo.
But
when we were in there, I want to say, we noticed a very considerable hostility towards the Albanians on the part of the Serbs.
All Serbs?
Yes. Not all Serbs, no, certainly.
But
not all Serbs. What we achieved also in the mission was that at some point we managed to get those two groups to work together within the organization, but there certainly was, against the OSCE mission and against Albanians in general, a very clear hostility on the part of the majority of the Serbs and on the part of the Serb authorities.
But you are aware now that people arriving at the border have been told to go and ask NATO for food, go and ask NATO for housing, that the assumption is that NATO is the ally of the Kosovars in bombing the rest of Yugoslavia, and that it is some kind of extension of the accord that gave the Kosovars a right to an air force. That it is seen as, the destruction is seen as having been caused in some sense by the Kosovars, Albanians.
Yes, but certainly there's a very violent conflict also before the NATO bombardments started. And I see no changes there. And
yet you did not have the imagination to see the escalation in the refugee crisis that has now ensued.
I didn't get that question.
I'm using your own phrase. You said we didn't have the imagination to see the escalation in the refugee crisis.
No, we did not have the imagination to see that so many people would be driven out of the country in this very violent manner as has happened.
Germaine Greer, thank you. Jorgen, thank you very much indeed. Jorgen Grenit, thank you very much. Prosecution, your next piece of video evidence.
Whatever the legalities of the bombing, and I have to tell you as a lawyer that Bruce Kent is right, but whatever the legalities, the purpose of this was to stop ethnic cleansing. That, because of the way in which this conflict has been conducted by NATO, has undoubtedly failed and has indeed got worse.
We have not been able to succeed in what was our initial objective in stopping the ethnic cleansing. Milosevic has gone on with his campaign of ethnic sectarianism and expulsions. So that's true.
A rather candid admission, Michael Ignatieff, isn't it? I mean, NATO does seem to have failed in its key objectives.
We're at day 60. My firm conviction is that the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of this country have looked us all in the face and said, we are going to reverse this plan of ethnic cleansing. We cannot prejudge the outcome of a long and difficult and bloody struggle. And my view is that none of these leaders will have credibility with any of you in this audience unless they keep faith with those promises. Those are the most serious promises a politician can make to us. It's up to us to make sure they do keep those promises.
Michael Ignatieff, thank you. Now, Germaine Greer, would you like to call your next witness, please?
I call Anne-Marie Ubi.
Anne-Marie Ubi works for the aid agency Médecins Sans Frontières. She has recently returned from the refugee camps on the borders of Kosovo.
I would like to ask you, Anne-Marie, about your impression of the difference between NATO's commitment to bombardment, highly professional, with incredible amounts of logistical and tactical and technical support, enormous quantities of money. We are told something like $2 billion a day, and the way in which the relief effort is organized. If our concern is the Kosovar Albanians, how are we showing it when it comes to taking care of them?
Well, I mean, I have great concerns about the way the aid is being provided and organized, but I would first say that aid costs a lot less than war, so it's bound to be pitiful compared to the war effort. The main problem we have on the ground is that of massive uncoordination, and the reason, I think, is that the refugees, having been annexed to this foreign policy issue, they are the reason why this war is being waged, and as a result everybody has wanted to have a slice of the action, and we have seen a lot of organizations, governments, NATO contingents wanting to do things for refugees, and what it has meant is that the overall relief effort is less fair, less organized, less effective than it should be. So at this point we should be in a position where the United Nations, if not in the overall conduct of the war, but certainly in the humanitarian side, is empowered. And it was very striking when I was there 10 days ago that UNHCR, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, was almost bankrupt on this crisis, and that, I think, is a valid parallel to draw.
Well, UNHCR were given a very strange brief, weren't they? I mean, they were told to raise funding from member governments of the UN for 100,000 people. This was during the Rambouillet discussions, and they didn't want to set it at any higher figure, although I think you'll find the forecast was that it would be very much higher. But in any event, they didn't get that money. They still have a $37 million shortfall on that initial funding. I mean, what does this suggest to you about our commitment to the Kosovar Albanians?
I think our commitment is mixed. I mean, I think another example, in addition to the UNHCR funding problems, is the fact that we haven't really been that keen to receive the people who have been displaced from their homes. I mean, in Albania and Macedonia, it's very clear that what we face is a great logistical and political problem. I mean, these countries have received a massive injection of populations. Some of them are not quite compatible, to use a sort of polite phrase, with their host populations. And I mean, I was quite struck when I was there by the kind of lack of political will to take on, particularly in Britain, I would say, to take more refugees, because I think it's hypocritical to say that this would further accepting people in need.
Anne-Marie, thank you for the moment. Just a moment to allow, therefore, the defence to cross-examine. Thank you.
I don't think we would disagree with your last point, Anne-Marie, but let's get back to what caused this exodus. Do you accept the United Nations figure of 350,000 ethnically cleansed before a single NATO bomb fell?
That's correct, yeah.
Do you think it makes very much difference whether you are ethnically cleansed slowly or quickly?
Not at all.
In that case, do you also agree, or will you confirm, that not a single Kosovo refugee blames NATO for their plight? They support the action. If anything, they want the action intensified, and this applies even to those whose relatives might have been killed by NATO mistakes.
So that's correct, but I think it's important to not see, when a humanitarian aid worker says that the NATO action precipitated the exodus, or the deportation, it doesn't mean that we prosecute the political will behind what's happened. We're just saying, well, if you set out to avoid a humanitarian catastrophe, well, you haven't really succeeded. Humanitarian people do not judge the purpose of a military action, but if I'm asked questions about how the refugees are being cared for, there is some unease there, because they're not being cared for properly, they are not registered, so they haven't got rights. A lot of, as you know, they haven't got their identities back. So I think, it's worthwhile sort of looking at that.
We don't have a problem with that. All we're trying to establish is that not a single Kosovo refugee blames NATO. They want the action to continue. Would you also acknowledge that you can't really make a judgment as to whether this has been successful until we're at the end game?
Yes, but what is the end game? I think the legitimate question, I think, is...
Until those refugees have got back to their homes in safety.
Yes, but a lot of them will not want to go back, and I think that's very important. When you look at when you're a refugee, you're asked in the first month of your exodus, do you want to go home? Of course you say yes. The issue will be when we get nearer to that end game, when perhaps we haven't got a very secure Kosovo, when we haven't got perhaps a free Kosovo, maybe we're talking about Gaza Strip-like arrangements, it will be much more complicated.
Thank you very much. The end game will be very much the last part of this trial. Now, In our studio audience here, we have one or two Kosovars and one or two Serbs. Safet Gashi, you're an Albanian Kosovar who works as a translator. You had to flee your homeland. What did you witness?
As a part of a crew, of a TV crew, hanging around all the whole territory in Kosovo, it was, I mean, obvious that you're going to see most of the things and the majority of the things, including all the refugees. When we are talking about 350,000 people who've been expelled, IDPs before the NATO bombing, most of the massacres, including Mreček, Obria, Orslan, I'm talking about 20 people and more dead. So basically, that's it. I mean, burning houses, so...
Let me then turn to a Serb, Natasha Krunic. What is the impact that the bombing is having on your family and your homeland?
Well, it made me appalled, really. I'd love to know why we can't live together anymore as we could until the day before yesterday. So I think we should talk about that. Perhaps, I mean, what happened? What really happened?
Well, perhaps, Rita Bashiri, you could answer that. What did happen?
Slobodan Milosevic happened. Ethnic persecution started 10 years ago. Ethnic cleansing started last year. NATO action or not, it would have been carried out. The only difference is that the murderous regime is being made to pay a price. And I understand some people don't like that, but we are talking about a regime that's used to getting away with it. It isn't the first time that the ethnic cleansing has happened in the Balkans.
Branka Lantinkic, you're a Serb. What solution is there to the crisis?
Well, may I just say first that this isn't really about Milosevic, and you and everybody has been talking about that all along this evening. This war is indiscriminate war against all the peoples of Yugoslavia, Serbs, Albanians alike, and Hungarians. Everybody lives there.
Thank you very much. So, let us ask the question, how much longer can NATO keep bombing? And how can the crisis be resolved? And is the NATO alliance itself beginning to fracture anyway? Join us after the break. Previous weekend of aerial bombardment so far, NATO planes bombing again tonight. How much longer can we expect the campaign to continue? And what are the long-term consequences for NATO? First, Ben Bradshaw, your next piece of video evidence.
Thank you, John. Well, we've already heard how difficult it is to run a war if you're 19 democratic nations. It's running a war by committee. It's also much, much more difficult to run a propaganda campaign if you're a democracy. Milosevic shows us all the NATO mistakes, but the massacres, the rapes, the ethnic cleansing that's been happening in Kosovo, we have not seen, or hardly at all seen, on our television screens, with one exception, which was an amateur film that was smuggled out of Kosovo last week, of a massacre in the village of, and let me get this right, Izbica.
Clearly, war crimes are being committed. Clearly, this is an example of that. And clearly, the Serb efforts in Belgrade are to try to lie to the world and tell you that that just didn't happen.
Evidence, if you need it, Bob Marshall-Andrews, that this war simply has to continue if that sort of atrocity is going to be stopped.
I defer to nobody, John, and neither do many of the people who feel the way that I do at the horror that we perceive on those pictures. The reason why I oppose this war is because my analysis, and that of many other people, is that the way that we conduct it has made that immeasurably worse from the beginning, and is unlikely in the way that we are doing it to make it any better at all.
Bob Marshall-Andrews, thank you. Jermaine Greer for the prosecution. Your next witness, please.
I call Major General Sir Michael Rose.
General Sir Michael Rose led the United Nations peacekeeping forces in Bosnia.
Sir Michael, according to Jamie Shea and Robin Cook, we're on the brink of winning this war. Any minute now, the entire Serbian operation is going to collapse. Is this your impression of what's going on?
The logic of war is as old as history. If you wish to compel an opponent to comply with your political or humanitarian goals, as they are in this case, you have to use overwhelming force, overwhelming military force. You do not start a war with only one weapon in your armory. To have done so, and to limit the bombing to a flight level of 15,000 feet to try and avert a humanitarian crisis has been to invite Milosevic to accelerate his inhuman program against the Kosovo Albanians. It has been to invite failure, if not guarantee failure, on the part of NATO. NATO is the most powerful military alliance in the world. It represents 800,000 of the most wealthy people in the world. It has an army that could defeat the Yugoslav army with little difficulty on the ground. Of course there would be casualties, but what extraordinary moral logic is there where a NATO pilot or a NATO soldier's life is worth more than a Kosovo Albanian?